Welcome back to Fast Market on the TD Ameritrade Network. I'm Tom White, joined by my co-host Kevin Hinks. But let's bring in our next guest for our cash tag segment, and that's going to be Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at LikeFolio. Welcome back to the show, Megan.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, so we're talking food. It's almost lunchtime. I'm hungry, especially looking at some of the names within that make up Darden restaurants. You know, you've got high-end with Capital Grille, Eddie V's, and then you've got, that middle of the range with Longhorn Steakhouse. Olive Garden's their big one. What kind of data are you guys seeing here? Because it seems like restaurants are full across the board.
Yeah, so whenever we look at a name like Darden, as you mentioned, they have a lot of different restaurants underneath their umbrella. And, it's interesting because we're seeing another trend that is similar to the trend that we've noted in other companies, in that there's a separation for how its higher end brands are performing versus its middle or lower end brands are performing. And so whenever we break this out, we know that last quarter, Darden beat expectations partially because of this outperformance in its fine dining segment. So the Capital Grille, Eddie V's, and whenever we look at this from our perspective, we do see this trend continuing into the current quarter that we're in now, and also in the quarter that they're about to report. Whenever we break out from a happiness level, all of the different brands that fall underneath Darden's umbrella, we brought the 5 most popular brands, at least from a consumer mention perspective in our data, to kind of plot those out. And you can see Eddie V's and Capital Grille, those occupy the top spots at almost 87% positive, 84% positive. These are really high numbers comparatively. And then you've got Olive Garden at 70% positive, which is still respectable. And I think another important note here whenever you're looking at this is to consider the overall volume of mentions. So in our database, Olive Garden comprises the lion's share of mentions under this. So you would expect sentiment to be a bit lower, but it still is interesting to see that Eddie V's and Capital Grille outperforming. And then also when we look at these brands from a just buzz growth perspective, we see the same thing. We see Eddie V's buzz growth up about 29% year over year in the current quarter. We see the Capital Grille up about 10% in the current quarter. And then we've got Olive Garden down about 6% in the current quarter, and Longhorn down even more, about 33% in the current quarter. So you can kind of see a split here, and all of this leads up to a comprehensive purchase intent value about 12% lower than we were last year. And a lot of that is due to this weighting of how many more consumers are talking about, say, an Olive Garden or Longhorn or Cheddar's versus the Capital Grille and Eddie V's. But I think the moral of the story from our perspective is we see kind of a mixed bag for Darden in the fact that its fine dining segment continues to still be growing and continues to still look like it's doing well. And then we're seeing a slight pullback in that the regular restaurant mentions that really we're looking at Olive Garden and Longhorn and Cheddar's.
Megan, I think this is the fascinating breakdown of the U.S. economy as we find it right now. There's people doing better than other people, and the lower ends of the income scale are getting hit by inflation more than the upper ends, right? You still see M2, the overall savings, remaining high, so people have money. That's why I think you're seeing the higher end. Just going to the fact that looking at Longhorn Steakhouse versus Capital Grille, right? Medium price steak versus higher price steak, and when you compare those two, I think it's fascinating how Darden kind of hedges itself, right, with every price point along the way, and some are doing better than others. But this is pretty indicative, right, of the economy we find ourselves in, where the inflation is hitting the middle to lower end tier income more than it's hitting the higher end tier income, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We've seen the same phenomenon in Lululemon. When we look at apparel, we see the same thing in terms of, home improvement and decor. When we look at names like Restoration Hardware, there's kind of a split in where growth is. But I think you mentioned another good point in the fact that Darden does have options for all of these different consumers. So, it still has these avenues for growth in these higher end names because it has such an expansive portfolio. Whenever we look at it, just comprehensively, though, as a company, we do see it somewhat lagging peers. I know we had it up on that scatter chart above, and you can see that in terms of at least demand growth on a year-over-year basis, it's trailing pretty significantly. And then whenever you consider who's doing well, you see the Brinkers, which comprise that's Chili's, that's Maggiano's, which you could consider to be middle. I would say middle range restaurants, maybe Maggiano's a little bit higher end, and you can see it outperforming, but all of these kind of in the same boat. So whenever we look at this space overall, the overall trend is a little bit of tapering in this current quarter, and this matches just overall restaurant mentions. Our data is telling us that there might be a little bit of a pullback, at least on a quarter-over-quarter spend, in terms of mentions of people who are talking about going out to eat and going to a restaurant. We see those down about 7% quarter-over-quarter. So these numbers are still higher on a year-over-year basis. To be clear, there are still more people that are going out to eat now than there were a year ago, but that growth rate is starting to slow down in the current quarter. So, maybe consumers are this could be the first time that, starting to feel the squeeze of those inflationary pressures that we all know about very well.
Yeah, and if you're around the city of Chicago, every restaurant seems to be packed. They don't have a lot of these downtown, but it seems like people want to go out. They're exhausted from getting delivery, cooking at home maybe a little bit. But I was curious about the scatter plot that you have. It seems like Darden's got the widest array, as you mentioned. It's pretty surprising to see your data here, kind of reflective that Darden, as far as being on the far left and upper, compared to some of the other names that only have a few that make up those restaurant groups, Bloomin' and EAT. It's pretty surprising that they're not getting that, that purchase intent going higher with that broad base.
Yeah, I think that for us, that what this is really indicative of is some underperformance in Olive Garden. Just comprehensively, if you look at all of the different restaurants that are included on this scatter plot, you got to think about Outback, Cheesecake Factory, as I mentioned, the Chili's and the Maggiano's underneath that EAT ticker. Olive Garden is definitely the largest just from a volume perspective. So the skew of the mentions is really weighted toward that. And I think Olive Garden comprises about half of Darden's revenue. So this is somewhat fair for sure. But that is one area of concern that we're watching heading into earnings, is that we are seeing some continued underperformance from its Olive Garden segment, which is its biggest piece of its sales. So we'd like to see some improvements there. And so far, at least in this current quarter, we're just not seeing that.
Well, that's going to be questionable, probably guidance. Do you have an earnings score for Darden going into these results tomorrow morning?
Yeah, we are officially neutral heading into this earnings report. We're at a -15. So for us, that's a slight bearish lean, but officially neutral for this report.
Neutral going into that. All right, great stuff as always, Megan. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thanks, guys. You too.
All right, that's Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at LikeFolio, helping us break down the data on this. Kevin,